I'm Jennifer Cobbe. I'm a Research Associate in the Department of Computer Science and Technology at the University of Cambridge. I'm part of the Compliant and Accountable Systems Research Group. We're an interdisciplinary team of computer science and law academics exploring technical and legal interventions that could help technology work better with society's interests. Our paper proposes a systematic, practical framework to provide useful transparency of automated decision-making that supports meaningful accountability of many kinds. This is based on our understanding of automated decision-making as a process, beginning with the conception of the system and continuing through building the model, making decisions, and evaluating those decisions in practice. The Reviewability Framework provides a holistic view across this whole process. I'll first take you through why we need to look beyond models if we want to achieve meaningful accountability of automated decision-making. Next, I'll discuss the origins of reviewability in our work on applying administrative law to automated decision-making. And then I'll set out what our reviewability framework looks like and how it works. First, I want to clarify here what we mean by accountability. We draw from Mark Bovens's model, whereby accountability involves an actor from whom an account is owed, a forum to whom it is given, and a relationship of accountability between them. Also considered is the nature of the account and any consequences flowing from it. For accountability to be meaningful, information given by the actor should support effective deliberation and discussion by the forum. It should also support the imposition of any consequences by the forum on the actor. By automated decision-making, we mean decisions about the rights or interests of natural or legal persons made by other natural or legal persons using automated systems. In some cases, these automated systems will directly produce a decision. In others, they produce information on which a human decision-maker will subsequently base their decision, either in whole or in part. They might lead to some subsequent action or process, perhaps connecting to other automated systems. We understand automated decision-making as a broad socio-technical process, beginning before decisions are made and extending afterwards. The technical components of ADM systems don't exist on their own. They're only one part of a broader human and technical assemblage, a socio-technical algorithmic system. People are involved in their design, development, deployment, and use. And the choices and actions of those people are instrumental in determining the functioning of the system. Because of this, for meaningful accountability, it's important to understand the various aspects of that algorithmic system together. To help with this, we draw from administrative law's understanding of human decision-making as a process. Administrative law is primarily concerned with holding decision-makers in the public sector to account. Administrative law as a framework and judicial review as an oversight mechanism have developed to provide accountability for the complexity and opacity of human decision-making. So their approach to accountability is uniquely relevant to thinking about accountability in other complex, opaque forms of decision-making. English administrative law, which we draw from, has been developed by senior courts over decades and applies to even the most consequential decisions, including of literal life and death. In administrative law, courts aren't really looking at whether a decision's outcome was right or wrong. Instead, the law sets certain standards that apply to the process of making decisions. These can be things like whether the right information was taken into account, whether the decision maker had the authority to take the decision, whether there was any appearance of bias, whether there was any discrimination or discriminatory effects in practice, and so on. And judicial review as an oversight mechanism assesses whether that decision-making process complied with those standards. We don't argue that administrative law's standards or other legal requirements specific to public sector decision-making should apply to algorithmic systems in other sectors. That's not our position. But we do argue that understanding decision-making as a process, beginning before a decision is actually made and continuing on to its effects, is relevant here. This approach points us in the right direction for a framework for accountable automated decision-making, applicable in any sector, relevant to any standards. Just as understanding human decision-making as a process allows judicial review to identify points to assess whether various aspects of that process comply with the law, so too understanding automated decision-making as a process similarly offers opportunities to assess whether various aspects of that process are working as they should. With ADM, we can identify points along the process where choices by people have a potentially significant impact, both on the functioning of the system as a whole and on the individual decisions it makes. And we can think about this process as it relates to any algorithmic system, not just to ADM. So we can identify 4 more or less distinct stages of this process that broadly exist in most, if not all, algorithmic systems: commissioning, development, operation, and investigation. In ADM systems, a specific kind of algorithmic system, we can call these stages commissioning, model building, decision-making, and investigation. For meaningful accountability, we need to look across this whole process, considering each of these stages. Otherwise, we might miss aspects of the process that are crucial for understanding how and why it functions, and how and why individual decisions have been reached. However, much recent research and policy discussion has focused on making models interpretable or on producing explanations of how they reach their outputs. These often focus primarily on the functioning of the model as it is used to make decisions, which we locate in the decision-making of the process. Some proposals, such as data sheets for datasets or model cards for model reporting, do try to look more broadly, but they still focus primarily on the model building stage. But because ADM is a broad socio-technical process, mechanisms focused only on models or even on model development are too narrow for meaningful accountability. Because algorithmic systems have both human and technical elements, explanations or other mechanisms focused on models can provide an account of the process as a whole. These mechanisms can be useful for understanding the functioning of the model itself, but problems with algorithmic systems often originate outside the model, in the purposes for which it is used, for instance, or with improper assumptions in its design, or in failing to properly assess the system and its outputs to make sure it's working properly, or in other human and organizational factors around the model. By focusing on model-centric mechanisms for accountability, other aspects of the process, potentially more relevant to many accountability relationships, might end up under-discussed. Indeed, this emphasis on models may itself unwittingly contribute to opacity, obscuring the need for mechanisms to address other aspects of those processes. For ADM to be meaningfully accountable, transparency mechanisms need to give a view across the whole socio-technical process, from commissioning the system, through designing the model, selecting training data, and training and testing procedures, to making individual decisions, and on to the effects of those decisions in practice and any subsequent investigation, assessment of functioning, or audit. There are some mechanisms that will be useful in various stages of this process, such as the data sheets or model cards I mentioned earlier, but these are still relatively narrow. They aren't part of a broader framework that captures the whole process. Implementing some transparency mechanisms at some points of the process in a more or less piecemeal fashion likely won't bring as much benefit as might be hoped. But you also shouldn't just log everything and provide it to whomever an account is owed. Accountability is highly contextual. Different actors will account to different forums for different aspects of the process, and the kinds, levels, and formats of information needed for a meaningful account will depend heavily on the forum and the nature of the accountability relationship. As well as the potential to not provide enough information, there are also risks in providing too much information to make use of, or the wrong kind of information, or the right kind of information presented in the wrong way to be understandable by the forum. Meaningful accountability needs the right kind of information about aspects of the process relevant to the likely accountability relationships, presented in an appropriate way for those relationships. So we propose that record keeping, logging, and other documentary mechanisms should provide contextually appropriate information to support relevant forms of accountability. By contextually appropriate, we mean information that is relevant to the accountability relationships involved, accurate in that it is correct, complete, and representative, proportionate to the level of transparency required, and comprehensible to those to whom an account will likely to be owed. By considering each of these 4 factors of the ADM process, we can potentially bring about useful transparency to support meaningful accountability relationships. Understanding ADM as a process thus allows us to systematically consider which contextually appropriate record keeping, logging, and other documentary mechanisms at each stage of the process can allow for the process as a whole to be reviewed. To support meaningful accountability in this way, we argue that ADM processes should be designed and developed to be reviewable. Reviewability as a general concept involves technical and organizational record keeping and logging mechanisms across the entire ADM process. These would expose the contextually appropriate information that's needed to assess algorithmic systems, their design, their context, and their outputs for legal compliance, for whether they're functioning within expected or desired parameters, or for any other form of assessment relevant to any other accountability relationship. Reviewability thus seeks to provide a holistic view of the technical and organizational elements involved in producing an automated decision, considering factors both at design time and at runtime. The commission, design, deployment, and use of ADM processes are all within scope of reviewability, as are the consequences of their use and any auditing and investigation of those processes. Reviewable ADM processes are therefore those that systematically implement technical and organizational record keeping and logging mechanisms at all stages of the process: commissioning, model building, decision making, and investigation. This allows holistic review of the algorithmic system, its development, its context, and outcomes. To help with this, we propose a reviewability framework that breaks the ADM process down into its constituent parts. This allows for systematic assessment of what kinds of mechanisms might help achieve useful transparency across that process. Note that we don't prescribe how to build reviewable systems or propose new technical or organizational solutions. Instead, this framework helps those responsible for systems to systematically consider which information is necessary for providing useful transparency, thereby enabling meaningful accountability in the context of a model-driven ADM process. In the paper, we integrate some existing proposals for accountability mechanisms into this framework to show how and where in the process they can help provide that useful transparency when implemented systematically. Following from the earlier discussion of algorithmic systems as a process, we have 4 stages in this framework. First is the initial commissioning of the system. Next is building the system's model. Then is actually using the system to make decisions. And finally, investigations of the system, including audits and assessments of discrimination and of the system's impact and suitability in practice. Each of these 4 stages consists of several steps, as you can see. So, for example, in the commissioning stage, steps include procuring the system, defining the problem to be addressed in using the system, and any assessments of the proposed system's impact on things like data protection, privacy, equality, or human rights that might be undertaken prior to developing the system. Within this framework, those responsible for systems can systematically implement transparency mechanisms as they work through the steps and stages of the process. Again, reviewability doesn't just mean indiscriminate logging or record keeping at each step. Across each of these stages and steps, those responsible for ADM can consider from which actors and to which forums accounts are likely to be owed. This allows various kinds of likely accountability relationship to be understood. This is contextual and should be considered on a case-by-case basis while moving through the process. Multiple actors will likely have different accountability obligations across different aspects of the process. What the designers of the system will be accountable for will likely differ from what people actually using the systems to make decisions will be accountable for instance. Having considered what kinds of accountability relationships are likely to relate to a system, those responsible for it can then consider what kind of transparency mechanisms would provide the information that is contextually appropriate for those relationships. Again, contextually appropriate means information that is relevant to the accountability relationships involved, accurate, complete, and representative, proportionate to the level of transparency likely to be required, and comprehensible by the relevant forums. By considering each stage systematically in this way, the ADM process as a whole can be made reviewable. This facilitates meaningful accounts of its operation to those to whom they may be owed. The steps and stages on this process that we identify exist for people designing, developing, deploying, and using systems to take some action, or make some choice relating to the process, or where technical components process data in some way. They can be considered discretely and together, underpinning a framework for developing and assessing reviewable automated decision-making processes. At each stage, there are opportunities to place limits on the algorithmic system and define desirable or undesirable behaviour or functionality, implement relevant transparency mechanisms to record contextually appropriate information about actions, decisions, or processing, review compliance with those limits and the system's general functioning, and revise the process or take other action as required. Reviewability thus supports a non-linear, iterative, and cyclical process of review, feedback, and revision. Practitioners may move back and forward between steps, depending on their role and the situation, as systems are developed, deployed, used, and revised. And in some systems, various steps may in practice be effectively combined. Indeed, not all steps will occur with each algorithmic system, and some will be more relevant than others. But at a high level, these steps and stages will be common to many ADM processes. And information can be fed back from the forum following from their deliberation and assessment of the system. The Reviewability Framework thus offers useful transparency of ADM processes both at design time and, crucially, at runtime. This provides information not just on how the algorithmic system was designed, developed, or intended to operate, but also on how it functions and what kinds of decisions it produces in practice. By providing information at key points of the ADM process, reviewability thus assists in assessing individual decisions and in determining whether the algorithmic system as a whole is functioning as intended or required. By systematically implementing targeted technical and organisational transparency mechanisms to enable the provision of contextually appropriate information about the process as a whole, reviewable ADM processes thus support meaningful accountability relationships between the multiple actors involved in the process and various relevant forums. I just want to finish by saying that reviewability can't do everything. Even reviewable systems can't capture broader business processes, the wider context of ADM systems, or the situations in which they're embedded. They may not capture interactions with other socio-technical processes, which form part of wider, complex, interconnected systems of systems. And it's important to remember that even contextually appropriate information is always open to subjective interpretation and contestation. These limitations reflect the limitations of the fairness, accountability, and transparency frame in general. We acknowledge that simply making systems more transparent or accountable is insufficient without addressing questions of power and political economy. And we recognise that automated decision-making has the potential to bring serious harm if it is done inappropriately or responsibly. Accountability on its own isn't enough to deal with many of these issues, whether through reviewability or otherwise. We really need legal, regulatory, and financial penalties and incentives to help here. But if, as seems likely, automated decision-making is increasingly prominent in future, we believe that reviewability offers a way of achieving meaningful accountability across ADM processes to support other interventions that seek to make a positive difference. Thank you very much for listening.